I'll explain this at the end of the presentation. I was actually going to start our conversation today by sharing numbers about global warming. But then I realized that when you look at numbers after a while, they really just become numbers and you lose your touch with the meaning behind these numbers. So I'm actually going to start with an invitation to all of you to think about what is your personal story, what is your connection. When we talk about things like climate change and energy transformation and environment, I mean, maybe it's a camping trip you had to cancel because of forest fires. Maybe it's a conversation you needed to have with your children because of climate anxiety. My story this year that really hit home was the story around the monarch butterfly. They were added to the endangered species list earlier this year. And despite me putting a lot of efforts into creating a garden for pollinators, I only saw 2 monarch butterflies this year. So when we look at the numbers, I would just really encourage you, think back about that connection, because there's a reason why we look at statistics, but it's the meaning behind it. So looking at some numbers, the first one is percentage-wise, how much of our primary energy do you think still comes from fossil fuels today? 30%. That number is still very high, it's 82%. So when we burn those fossil fuels, how much of our greenhouse gases do we generate from this? This number is 75%. So it's still, our system today still very much relies on fossil fuels. And if you look at the mix of sources of energy in the world, you can see that over the last 20 years, I mean, the trend has stayed pretty steady. We know renewables are growing very rapidly, but we also live in a world that demands more and more energy. So percentage-wise, not much has shifted, yet we are looking at a downward curve like this. And this is really where carbon capture enters the stage. Because we know, looking at the data, that while we are working through the energy transition, fossil fuels will continue to play a key role in our system. We will continue to burn them, and we will continue to create CO2 emissions. Carbon capture is one of the key technologies that can help industries like cement, steel, petrochem, and oil and gas to decarbonize. And while carbon capture is not a new technology, I would certainly not go as far to call it a mature technology, because if you look at the numbers, currently about 37 billion tons of CO2 emissions, that is just CO2, and we're capturing 0.1% of this globally through carbon capture. In Canada, those numbers look a little bit better, or at 0.5%, but it's really still a drop in the bucket if we think about using this technology to decarbonize our energy system. So what does that mean for Canada and for, let's say, the fun but challenging road ahead of us? So currently we capture around 4 million tons per year of carbon capture. These projects took around 7-ish years from start to finish. Announcements by just the oil sands, so this does not include other industries like cement, etc., are around 20 million tons to be captured by 2030. So that's a 5-fold increase in the same 7 years that we did the first 4. Having said that, the federal government's emission reduction targets for 2030 are actually 80 million tons. So you can see carbon capture will only cover a small portion of it. So not only is the pace and scale that we need to scale this up quite significant, it's not the only challenge we have on our plate. There's other initiatives that will keep us all busy. So I think this really just brings home that, yes, it's important, we are working on it, but the road ahead is quite challenging. And last but not least, carbon capture allows us to create a low carbon economy, but it doesn't get us to a no carbon economy, which is where we need to be by 2050. Over the last 6 months, through work with the Energy Futures Lab, myself and others, we had conversations with quite a few people, and several of you are in the room here. And there's really two themes that came out of those conversations. And the first one I'd say is really positive, and we have to recognize that in the space of carbon capture, there's a lot of momentum created in the system right now. I mean, the 20 million is announced, projects announced, pore space allocation is probably some of the best, what's happening in Alberta, some of the best compared to the rest of the world. So there's some real positive energy behind it. Having said that, the second narrative was really a set of challenges. Recognizing that the space of carbon capture, the ecosystem, is complex and there's real challenges in front of us. And just to highlight three of these, first one is incentives. It's really the elephant in the room. We know with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, there's a real risk that investment money will not happen here, but it will happen south of the border. If you're an optimist like I am, and you've read the news, hopefully the government is thinking to opt it, but at the moment, this is the situation that we're in today. The second one is subsurface. It's a topic that probably does not get the attention that it deserves, but it is a real challenge. And if you look at projects around the world that have taken place, there's a lot of challenges happening in the subsurface space. And last but not least is Indigenous partnerships. Clear messages that these projects cannot and should not move forward without either Indigenous ownership or partnerships. So where does that lead us with the Energy Futures Lab? Well, we had a workshop in September in Canmore, and we had about 10 participants in that workshop, and we asked two questions. And the first one is there a space for the Energy Futures Lab to help accelerate and help ensure the success of carbon capture? And we got a unanimous yes. When we then asked the second question, what does that look like? I think we got 10 different answers from 10 different people. So it really shows us the complexity of the system, and it's hard to pinpoint in a rapidly moving system where we got to throw our weight behind it. So our proposal is the next, that we're basically going to take a step back. We're going to look at the system in a holistic manner and kind of a strategic manner, update the ecosystem map, talk to players who are actively participating in this field, and through that work, draw up what an initiative could look like for the Energy Futures Lab to participate. Call to action for all of us here in the room. Well, the short-term one is very simple because we by now know the concept of the breakout rooms. So come and find us. Steven and David will have agreed to co-host. This is where you nod. But long-term, if next week or a month from now or a year from now you come up across something, let's connect and let's have the conversation. And as I said, I promised to explain the title, No Refunds. I would say that the challenge in front of us is real. And if we don't do this well, we either don't hit our reduction targets because these projects aren't moving forward, or they're moving forward but they're struggling. I'd say Mother Nature and society will not give us a refund. So the challenges are real, and I think it needs all of us to make this a success. Thank you.